I think we're going to get started here. Thank you for attending this track here. So my name is Jin Cho. I'm a local Microsoft representative. So I'm a cloud architect working with all the enterprise Fortune 1000 companies in the Twin Cities. So I have the privilege today to introduce your speaker today. His name is Rich Daddy, and Rich Daddy is a management consultant, writer, coach, and workshop leader. As a senior consultant with Tricentral, a management consulting firm focused on business improvement, he has consulted with the organization on business architecture, strategy, crisis management, leadership. Rich is co-founder of Headspace Partners and is currently finishing work on a book called Sustainability, No Business Should Ever Fail, a leader guide for designing healthy culture. Rich is also a second-degree black belt and martial art instructor. So I'm thinking you probably ask questions, but, probably appropriate ones, right? Anyway, so we have the pleasure to sponsor this track today. Microsoft obviously is innovating in lots of different places, but especially in the enterprise space with cloud first and mobile first strategy from our new CEO, Satya. So without further delay, Rich, go ahead.
Thank you. Yep. Let's see if this works. Can you hear me? Is this mic on? I probably want to turn this one off. How's that? Good. I apologize to the people over here. I have this bright interrogation light like shining right in my eyes, so I probably won't look at you. But good morning, everyone. Imagine for a couple of minutes here, take a journey with me, that you're an executive with a software consulting company that's just in the process of being acquired. And you and the chief technology officer are on your way down to Jacksonville, Florida, to meet with the new bosses, the acquirers, to talk about the new strategy. And you were just informed this past week that your business model was all wrong. The way to make money in consulting isn't the way you've been doing it for all these years. It's really to hire street sweepers and build them out as architects. That's going to be the new path. And that really happened. So you're on the plane, flying at 37,000 feet, sitting next to your chief technology officer, Dave, and you're just going through all the different crises that are just ready to hit you with this acquisition. Everything from your job might be gone, the culture might be destroyed, your business model is certainly going to go up in flames. And it's pretty much an anxious beginning of the trip. And all of a sudden, the plane starts to shake, and then banks left really hard and starts to descend. So we get a little more anxious, and the pilot gets on and makes the announcement about 30 seconds later. And he said, there's been an air traffic control emergency, and we're being diverted. We have to land in Charlotte, North Carolina. So me being the curious person that I am, I reached for the phone that's on the back of the seat. It was 767, and called somebody back at the office and said, air traffic control emergency, what's going on? Tell me more. I'm curious. So my friend Joe spent a couple of minutes trying to convince me that 2 planes had just crashed into the World Trade Center. That was tough to believe. But anyway, we landed in Charlotte a couple minutes later. Luckily, Delta had a gate that was available. We pulled in, able to get out. And the whole gate area, hundreds of people, hundreds. And there were several TVs up on the wall, and there were people just gathered around the TVs watching CNN, watching these planes hit. They had 2 different looks on their faces. One was deer in the headlights. The other was just panic. Well, Dave went over to one of the TV sets, and I immediately headed to the payphones. Does everybody remember what a payphone is? So I stood in line. I had my mobile phone out. We had them back then. Trying to get a hold of the corporate travel agent. But the mobile phones weren't working, so waited in line, finally got to the payphone, got in touch with the corporate travel agent, and said, We're stuck in Charlotte. I need to get home. Get me a car. So she gets back on the phone after a couple of seconds and said, sorry, can't get you a car. You know, the only cars that are available in Charlotte are ones that need to stay in Charlotte. No one-way travel. I said, okay, go back, tell them I want to stay in Charlotte, just get me a car. I don't care how you have to answer the questions, just get me a car. So she comes back on with a confirmation number. She said, go find the budget counter. So I did. I made my way through the airport. Dave's still watching TV. Budget counter and Avis counter, all the rental car counters had hundreds of people just piled around, just in a panic. So I got as close as I could. I said, I have a confirmation number. What do I do? Somebody said, go get the bus outside. Went outside. The bus is pulling away, and I ran after it, flagged it down. It stopped. There were 3 other people on the bus. I was the 4th person. We pulled into the budget lot. 4 cars in the lot. I got the last car in Charlotte. Where's Dave? I left him back at the airport. So I drive back to the airport, pull into the parking lot, start walking back to go find him. And a police officer meets me halfway in the road and said, lockdown, you can't go in there. I said, no problem. I just need to go find Dave. You know, just won't be long. Nope, not getting in. So I started walking back to the car. When he wasn't looking anymore, I went to the other entrance. Got stopped in the middle again. A different police officer. Same story, same result. But I wasn't going to be deterred. I kept trying. Finally, I tried an entrance. Police officer came out, and she said, can't go in. It's locked down. I explained my story. I guess she realized I wasn't going to blow up the airport, so she let me in. Eventually found Dave and the mass of people still glued to CNN. We got out of there, stopped at a convenience store, threw a whole bunch of junk food in the back of the car, and we weren't staying in Charlotte. Headed up the Shenandoah Valley, made a quick overnight stop in some little town at some little motel that had space, and we were home with our families the next afternoon. So, in all crises, there are forks in the road. Depending on which path you pick on these forks is going to depend on whether you come out of the crisis stronger, weaker, or maybe not at all. And unfortunately, it's hard to see these forks in the road. It often seems like one path, that path of least resistance. And it's the crisis defining what that path is. Well, on 9/11, I guess I was able to see the forks in the road. And I was able to pick the right path because at the end of the day, I was home a day and a half later with my family when there were a lot of other people that were stuck. They were stuck, some people for weeks. But it wasn't really fair. It's not a fair comparison to compare me with everybody else because I had an advantage over everybody else. Not that I was smarter. I certainly wasn't. Not that I was luckier. My Delta flight was, I think, one of the last ones to land in the entire day in the entire nation. So there were plenty of other people that had the opportunity to get that last car. My advantage is I'm predisposed, sort of in my DNA, to be able to manage crises. And I'm just kind of built that way. And that advantage comes from simply a little bit of OCD and a little bit of ADD. And there's a lot of bad stuff that goes along with that, but sometimes, boy, it really pays off because I'm really hyper-focused on outcome. I'm super sensitive to when the system's out of whack. The hairs on the back of your neck stand up and you say, something's not right here. And the other thing is you're super aware of the different paths to that outcome, the forks in the road. So because of that, I was super prepared. Now, organizations, when they are in crisis, end up having to deal with forks in the road too. And regardless of what crisis your organization faces, there are 8 forks in the road. that inevitably you are always going to face. Now, hopefully, you see them. And hopefully, you can get on the right path. And if you do all that, you're going to be okay. But luckily, you can predispose your organization to be able to handle crises, to be able to see the path or the forks, and to be able to get on the right path. Sort of like the organizational OCD, the organizational ADD. And that's business architecture. So what I'm going to tell you about are these 8 forks in the road that you will always see in an organization when it's in crisis. And I'm going to give you an example of how these play out and how they've played out in an organization that I've been a part of for 2 years, Minshore. And we were very lucky because we have a business architecture in place. And you'll see that because we had a business architecture in place, we were able to see these forks in the road. We were able to not all the time pick the right path, but when we didn't pick the right path, we were able to see that we were on the wrong path and pivot to get on the right path. And at the end of the day, it helped us come through the crisis that we called open enrollment last year and come out much stronger than we would have been without this. So the first fork in the road is keep the story relevant. The story was pretty clear before the crisis hit. With the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, that was intended to allow people to get insurance that wouldn't be able to afford it otherwise or wouldn't qualify otherwise. Well, our story needed to be to bring up a system that facilitated that transaction between the consumer and the insurance provider. Very simple story, very good story. I guess depending on your politics, it's good. But that was the story. Then the crisis hit. October 1st of last year, the system wasn't working. Major, major crises. And when crisis hits, everything changes, including the story. Well, of course, the crisis dictated that our story changed, and it wasn't, bring up a system to facilitate the transaction. It was all hands on deck. Everybody scramble 24/7. Don't be distracted. Fix the system so we have a system to facilitate the transaction. That was dictated by the crisis. Well, unfortunately, story is a big influencer of behavior. So if the story is out of whack, if the story isn't relevant, your behaviors are going to be out of whack. So an example of this is the day that people showed up at the front door of Minshore. Now, we didn't have a big sign down in St. Paul. We didn't publicize our address. Somehow people found us, buzzed upstairs and said, "Help, we need to get insurance." Now, I don't know if they had surgery scheduled for January. I don't know if they lost their job. Whatever reason, they were desperate. They were in a panic. So with the story, as the crisis had turned it into, those people were a distraction. We can't deal with you. We have to get the system working so then we can get you insurance, but we can't be bothered. Another reaction because of the story is we don't have a walk-in center capability, and if we let these people up, then they're going to tell their friends, and their friends will show up, and then they're going to tell their friends, and their friends will show up. Oh my gosh, distracting. We won't have a system. We have to focus on the system. The story wasn't relevant. We had great leadership. Our COO, who was the one who had us develop the business architecture, was just fabulous, and he recognized, wait a minute, we need to make our story relevant. This is the wrong behavior. What we really need to do is change the story to be facilitate the transaction, even though the system isn't working, but find other ways. So get people enrolled no matter what. That's the story. That's the priority. Shifted the behaviors. It shifted the thinking of the organization. The next fork is find a common language. The keynote talked about common language. Business architecture, one of the benefits is providing that common language that everybody can understand. And then a crisis hits, and the language changes. We start talking about defects. We start talking about buckets where consumers are stuck. We start talking about the pending queue, where people are waiting because we need to get verifications. All this stuff that is just bubbling up because the system isn't working right. That's the language we start to use. That's the language we use with the board of directors. That's the language we use with the executives. That's the language we use with the governor. And then they get used to the language. Probably they're not really sure what it means. Buckets of people stuck. Okay, we know we need to get rid of those stuck people. And everybody starts using that language. But you have consumers that are sitting in the board meeting listening to that language saying, what's this mean to me? I don't get it. Buckets? I just want insurance. I just want to be enrolled. I don't care about buckets. I don't care about pending queue. I don't care about defects. So now your language isn't a common language anymore. It's the language of the crisis. Go back to the common language you have with your business architecture. And what we used is an artifact that we had was stakeholder value. So we had our inventory of stakeholders. And for each stakeholder, we had the inventory of what value they expected from us, what outcome they expected. So that was the language that everybody understood. Consumers obviously understood that because they knew what value they expected. The executives, the board, they all understood it too. So we needed to tie everything, whether it's defects or the buckets of stuck consumers or the pending queue or all of these other things that were associated with the crisis, we needed to tie that to this common language so when we were talking about it, everybody understood what we were talking about. The third fork in the road is focusing on the journey. It's easy in a crisis to focus on little tiny situations. Again, the bucket, and getting this bucket from 1,000 consumers down to 0 consumers. Oh, we've solved that situation. And then there's another situation because, oh yeah, there's another bucket. And there's this problem with the system. So you have all these situations that you're totally focused on, and we used to call it the crisis of the day. So there was no view, there was no vision of what's the exit, what's the door out of this crisis? And how are we closer to that door today than we were yesterday? How do we plan on being closer to that door tomorrow than we are today? If we don't focus on the journey, then we lose hope. We start getting in the mode of, well, every day brings just more situations to solve. We never feel like we're getting toward the end of it. We never see the light at the end of the tunnel. So what we did is pretty much every meeting, every communication, every time we talked about the crisis or the situations, we'd make sure we kind of align that with this gets us closer to here. This is where we need to go. And it wasn't always rosy. Sometimes we took 10 steps backwards. But that's okay, because we're farther away from the exit. That's okay. At least be clear about it. At least people know. Tomorrow maybe we'll be 10 steps closer. It gives people hope. Not only the customers, but your employees too, who need to see that crisis is a new way of life. The next one is Shatter Rigidity. Rigidity comes in a lot of different forms, but the big ones are hierarchy and process. Now, I'd still be in Charlotte today, however many years later, if I didn't shatter the rigidity of the car rental process. I had no intention of staying in Charlotte, but the arbitrary rule that, well, we have cars, but we can't give them to you because we don't want these cars to leave Charlotte, it really made no sense to me. So I decided that this process that they were imposing was just getting in the way of the outcome, and there was no real harm. I wasn't breaking any law. don't think. It wasn't putting anybody's life in danger. So I needed to break that down. As a leader in an organization, you need to look for these roadblocks, look for this rigidity that has no value. In normal times, this rigidity is a pain and it's not very effective, but when time is so constrained in a crisis, this is really an anchor that can drag you down. Be on the lookout for that and just break down that rigidity when you see it. A good example of this would be our call wait times were well over an hour during open enrollment last year because the call center wasn't staffed to deal with a crisis. Well, that was unacceptable, but we had great people. They were able to turn on a dime and bring in an army of folks to be able to staff up the call center so we can get those call times to manageable levels so our customers would be able to actually talk to people. That's great. You can bring in an army of people to fix the problem. And think about what happens when they have to sit there and do nothing because it's going to take a week to get them system access. Now, I'm not suggesting you don't do background checks because, let's just give them access without doing the process that's valuable. But a majority of the rigidity is likely unnecessary and can be broken down in an emergency and a crisis. So it's really important that as a leader, be aware of that, look for that, and shatter it whenever you can. The fifth fork in the road is when meetings start to trump the mission. This often happens when the governor or the chairman of the board or some other VIP decides, crisis. I better be informed because if this crisis doesn't go away soon, it's going to be my butt on the line. So now you have the meeting with the governor or the meeting with the chairman of the board. It's like, oh no, I need to prepare for that meeting. So I'm going to call all my direct reports together and say, I'm meeting with the governor. What could the governor ask? Give me all the information you have. Tell me what you know so I can be prepared. So, and all your people are going to meet with their people. Say, I'm meeting to try to prepare my boss for the meeting with the governor. Tell me everything you know so I can pass it along. And this cascades through the organization, and you end up having meetings to prepare for the meetings to prepare for the meetings. And it's all meaningless. Because when you think about it, what does the chairman of the board want to know? Wants to know what's the news story. Wants to know where's the exit to the crisis. And how are you going to get there? And tell me in a language that I understand. A common language. So from the perspective of the stakeholders, maybe. So if you're managing the crisis effectively, and you're aware of the forks in the road, and you're consciously taking the right path, you have all the information. You can direct the conversation with the VIPs. You're not going to sit there and just wait to be bombarded with questions that, honestly, in my experience, many of them are irrelevant because they're fishing for information. If you proactively share the information you have, you give them what they want. Make them part of it. But at the end of the day, when meetings start to trump mission, and you have meetings for the sake of meetings to prepare for other meetings, all that does is distract you from solving the problem. It distracts your entire organization, and they lose sight of what they're really trying to do. Number 6, the sixth fork, is create a tangible space where you can make things real. What happens during a crisis is there are so many meetings. You go in, here's what we got to deal with today, what are we going to do, here's our strategy, here are your action items, you go do this, and we'll come back tomorrow. Or we'll come back later in the day, or we have a conference call at 9 o'clock tonight. Then you go off. Well, when you disperse, a lot of the knowledge that went into that strategy or the action items, that disperses too. And yes, you have a project manager there, or you have somebody there taking minutes, and you have great minutes, and you have a great Excel spreadsheet with all these tasks and whatever else you want to put in it. But who really takes the time to read minutes from several meetings ago? I know I don't. That's a problem, because so much of the information just gets lost. So what do? What's the solution? You can't keep everybody in a room and lock them in there and say you can't leave. But the best way to think about this is, if you've ever seen an old war movie, World War II movie, or any kind of a war movie, there are always a few scenes where you have the generals gathered around the table. And on top of the table is the battlefield. And you have the river and the bridge, and you have the enemy over here and some buildings and the infantry and the tanks and all of that. So at any point in time, anybody can walk in that room and get a visual of what the battle looks like. This is where it is. If you're new to that battle, if you just flew in from wherever and you walk into that room, you know exactly the state of affairs. You know what's going on. You don't have to read minutes. You know. So valuable, especially if you were the one who just called in the Air Force to bomb that bridge and you notice that the infantry is just gathered at the foot of the bridge. You can see it instantly. You can avoid other disasters. So how does this work in an organization? Get a room, get a war room, and lay out your battlefield. Make it real. Put it up on the walls. Draw it. Build it in Legos if you have to. It doesn't matter. But just get it there so when somebody walks into the room, they could see, here's our prioritization. Here's how we're working on defects. These are the reports that we need. This is all the stuff that's going on. And you can walk in. Nobody has to explain it. You don't have to read any minutes. Bam. It's there. And the nice thing is, if you've modeled the business architecture, that's your starting point. Day one, put that model on the wall, or at least some form of that model, and everything ties back to that. All right, this one, open the kimono. In my experience, I love to be in a crisis situation. And in my entire career, I have never been in a situation where information was held back because we were worried or afraid or didn't want any kind of political ramifications of saying, here's what's happening, and sharing the information. It's all too often we try to hide things from our customers or hide things from the executives or hide things, and they're going to find out. They always find out. Every experience I've had in a crisis where information has been held tightly to the chest, people find out from other sources, and then you're in damage control. Right? Be upfront. You have the language, you have the story, you have all this other stuff we've been talking about. Be open and share it with them. It's absolutely going to probably cause a ruckus, but you'd rather be able to control the message rather than react to the message. Here, does a business architecture help you? Yeah, maybe a little bit, but really what this takes is just courage. It's hard to do that. We need to have some courage that if we're open and honest and we're able to tell the story, that we can handle it. And in the end, it's going to serve us better than holding that back and hoping people don't find out. Hoping we can fix the problem before anybody knew there was a problem. So, the last one, number 8, is, you might think, oh, that's silly. That's obvious. But there's an interesting story. Last week, I met with an executive at Minshore, and I've been trying to get on this person's calendar for 6 weeks now. Every time I got a meeting scheduled, it would get trumped by 17 other meetings. Couldn't get any of this person's time. It was impossible. So finally, last week, I got an hour of his time and got him in a room, closed the door. He kept his laptop shut, and we talked about operational readiness. That was the purpose of the meeting, and we had pretty much an open-ended conversation about it. And halfway through the meeting, he just kind of rolled back from the table and looked at me and said, "Thanks. This is the first time in weeks that I've actually taken the time to think." It was his exact words. It's so difficult in normal times, especially in a crisis, to say, I'm going to shut the laptop, I'm going to turn my phone off, I'm not going to answer the phone, I'm just going to think about what's going on. I'm just going to assess it in my head, I'm going to let my mind process it. If you don't do that, you're missing so many opportunities to figure out that there's a hole that needs to be filled, to figure out there might be a better way to do something. If you fail to do that, you're making your job harder, not easier. And again, this takes courage too, because if I'm not on my computer, if I'm not responding to emails, people might think that I'm not working. Do I get paid to think? Sorry. Do I get paid to think? I don't know. Do we? That's a good question. We should. It should be part of our job, shouldn't it? And the other thing we should do is, if you have people reporting to you or you're on a team, encourage the people on your team to think too. Because, especially if you have people reporting to you, they're probably thinking the same thing. Well, I don't want my boss to see me thinking, because that looks a lot like not working. So it's really important to encourage them to take the time to think. Get away from your desk. Get away from the office. Go for a walk. Do whatever. But it's so important. You'll be so much better off if you do that. So at the end of the day, you can't predict or prevent all the possible crises that could come at you from an organizational perspective. And you can't prepare for all the different scenarios of things that might happen. You just can't. But what you can do is you can set your organization up to be ready to deal with whatever crisis attacks, or whatever crisis inevitably comes and shows up at the front door. You can predispose your organization to be ready for that by not waiting for a crisis to model a business architecture. It's so important to do now. The second thing you can do is that when the inevitable crisis does hit, be on the lookout for these 8 forks in the road. Do your best to spot them. Do your best to get on the right path. And if you don't end up on the right path, pivot. Get on the right path. It's never too late. Do the right thing. And at the end of the day, you'll find that you come out of it better, stronger, and at least feeling good about yourself because you did all you can do than if you hadn't. Happy to take questions. I think I have time. So thank you. Any questions? Happy to. Yep.
Could you dig a little bit more into how the capabilities were used in some of the steps? Specifically, were you referencing them, for example, as the operational readiness? These capabilities are ready, these are not. Maybe just a little bit further insights how the capabilities explicitly came about.
Absolutely. So it's interesting because we initially aligned to our capability model, specifically the capability model, when we were looking for how do we have that common language and how do we use this to measure progress and where we are. And we had somebody put together a heat map of our capabilities. And it was interesting because the heat map was all red. Every single capability was degraded. Every single one. It's like, this might not be as useful to use, which is why we pivoted and said, let's look deeper in our business architecture for something that's going to be more useful. That's when we went to the stakeholder value artifact. So that's sort of a level down So here's how our capabilities map to the stakeholders, and here's how stakeholders map to the outcome expectations, the value they expect from us. If you look at capabilities, there would be a lot of work to show progress, whereas if you looked at that other artifact, the stakeholder value, we can show progress at a much more granular level that people could understand and align to.
And did you create that stakeholder value in the moment, in the crisis, or was that already part of your capability?
It was part of it was done, and we had to expand it. So it was done at a much higher level. So if you look at the capability or the value that an individual might expect, we had high-level outcomes or high-level values. But again, kind of too high level to show progress, we had to break those down a little farther. So basically, as a consumer, I want to get enrolled. I want to find out my eligibility, et cetera. Those are sometimes too big. So we needed to get to a point where I want to open my account. I want to add somebody to my household. And it was at that level. Absolutely. And we didn't use that until the crisis hit. We didn't align to that for communication purposes until after the crisis hit. It was very valuable, and we found it was very valuable, but it would have been valuable 6 months before open enrollment because it would help align people with where we were, and it would have forced us to be more transparent, I guess is the word, with yes, we can do this, no, we can't do that, yes, we can do this, we can't do that, but we should be able to do that by November. And that story would have started coming out much sooner. Does that make sense? Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah, exactly. It would have forced the conversation. Because to that point, the conversation was all, internally, was all system focused, function focused. It wasn't around the stakeholder. Exactly. So it sort of distanced the conversation from the ultimate consumer. And what are they going to see and what they want? And it's more of the, well, we have this function and that function. It becomes disconnected from the people you're really trying to emotionally connect with. So it would have forced sort of that different perspective. Not sure if it wouldn't have changed anything, but I think it would have changed the perception on October 1st. Right. Exactly.
So have you started pivoting, trying to be more proactive, using those stakeholder maps for the next leg of the journey?
Oh, absolutely. We're using that both for strategy and road mapping. Our communications people are using that to align with, to figure out how to communicate, who to communicate with, et cetera. Our contact center customer service reps are using that exact thing to say, okay, we might get a call from this stakeholder about this expectation. How do we respond? We're using that for operations, so we can't necessarily do this expectation or outcome that this stakeholder wants. What do we tell them? What do we do? What's the alternative? What's the contingency? So we're using that for a variety of different things. You have a question? Mm-hmm.
You're going to have some sense for what business functions and processes have certain, you can't perform them in a certain amount of time. What is that damage to customers or issues rather than whatever business might be starting?
Right.
It just seems like in a crisis, you're going to be looking for information where you can get it. That would be another option.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Another thing it does similar vein is for prioritization. So there's a lot of audits that happen in all organizations. And I like auditors. I think auditors are great because they point out where there are weaknesses that you can, fix. But auditors can be demanding sometimes, and there was a request for some information that was going to take a really long time to gather. But to say, well, that's going to take a long time to gather, we don't have time for that, that doesn't necessarily go over well. But if you can show the stakeholder values, say, to create this report, it's going to pull resources off of these couple of things and delay our ability to get these available for our stakeholders. Whereas if we can defer this for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it was and get these done first, I think it'll make our stakeholders happy. I'm sorry? But that's what, that's where we could use it and say, it's your choice. What would you like us to do? And if you can show them what the real impact of making anybody's request a top priority, usually the right answer comes out. Usually people aren't going to argue. The highest priority usually is very clear. And for us, we were able to use it for that as well. There were other questions? Is that a 10-minute warning? Okay. When I talk about a business architecture, the way I deal with a business architecture is everybody in the organization is familiar with the capability model because every time I've modeled it, I've sort of forced that. So it might not be at a very deep level, but they understand it. Because inevitably, if that's not part of your strategy for doing business architecture, you're wasting your time. Don't even do it. Don't even bother doing it, because one of the key features of modeling a business architecture is alignment up and down the organization. And when you get that, then people are much more comfortable making a decision down here, especially in a crisis, because they know they can tell where the lines are, and they're not going outside of the lines. The boundaries are clearer. But if there's not that alignment, the boundaries aren't clear. So they're afraid that, it's like the dog collar. It's like, if I go over here, am I going to get shocked? So you're paralyzed. And yes, a lot of organizations, okay, let's go in the ivory tower, and we'll develop our business architecture, and we'll post it on a wall, and maybe somebody will read it, and who cares? But that's not the right way to do it. You're not going to get the benefits of a business architecture that way. That's like going to a building architect and saying, I want to design a house, and they design this beautiful house, and you have the big blueprints, and then you put it in the trunk of your car and go to your builder and say, build me a house. If there's not alignment with the contractor and the carpenter and the framer and the electrician, who knows what you're going to get? And you want the electrician to be able to make the decision when they need to make the decision. One more, did you say? One or two? Any other questions?
As I review your 8 items here, what's implied but not explicitly called out is, as in your crisis on 9/11, assessing what resources you have. Right? You inherently knew to call your travel agency and use them as a resource as opposed to. So, how does that factor into these steps, or is that aligned to all of them, or is it just sort of?
It's aligned to all of them, because at any point in time, you're going to use what's available to you. You've got to get something done. What do I have? It's like when people are at the front door, we have to get them enrolled. How can we do it? Well, right now, we don't have a system. We don't have a backup system. We don't have an Excel spreadsheet to take their information. Come on in. We can take your information on paper. What do you have available? What resources do you have? Hey, we don't have a walk-in center. What do we do when we let these people in? It doesn't matter. Somebody sit with them. We all know what's going on. So what do you have available, and how do you make best use of it? And it changes throughout the crisis. It changes even when you're not in crisis. It's the same type of thing. And I'm not sure if I have time for one more. It doesn't look like it. What's that? Any other questions? I don't know what brief and concise is, so unless you're going to answer it.
How can you tell if an organization is in a different crisis? You can tell when they really don't.
It's subjective, I think. I think you hit it on the head. Is if you survive it and you look back and say, we did all right, let's learn from it and do it better next time. A lot of people look at Minshore and said, man, what a disaster. But if you're inside of it, you know that, wow, I think they did a heck of a job, and they had some really good leadership to come out of it as well as they did, given all the issues that they had to deal with, and given all the times they had to pivot. So, were mistakes made? Did we find that we were on the wrong path at times? Absolutely. But was there the leadership in place to be able to pivot to get on the right path? Absolutely. So I don't think it's ever perfect. So you have to learn from it, get better next time, and make sure you survive it. So with that, I think I'm done. Thank you very much.